Just giving a couple of more minutes for anybody who's waiting to come in to join us, and then we'll start. Right, I think we'll start our comrades. Well, welcome to the Communist Party's event to mark Holocaust Memorial Day 2023. My name is Ruth Stiles and I'm chair of the Communist Party. Just to advise you, this event is being live streamed on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. We have a couple of speakers here today, the first of which will be Professor Mary Davies, who will speak first, and then Jez Van Benstock, who will introduce his short film called The Holocaust Tourist. And once the film has been shown, both he and Mary will answer any questions that you may have. Could you put your questions into the Q&A, the little box on your Zoom application, so that we can know what you're asking. On that basis, I'm going to invite Mary Davies to speak. Well done, Mary. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So why do we celebrate Holocaust Memorial Day? How did it come about? It was launched only 23 years ago, on January the 27th, 2000, when representatives from 46 governments around the world met in Stockholm to discuss Holocaust education, remembrance and research, and they produced what was called the Stockholm Declaration, which said, a brief quote from it, "The magnitude of the Holocaust planned and carried out by the Nazis must forever be seared in our collective memory." And it went on to talk about the selfless sacrifice for those who defied the Nazis and sometimes gave their own lives to protect or rescue Holocaust victims. So why choose January the 27th as the day that we mark Holocaust Memorial Day? Well, because on this day, in 1945, the Red Army marched into Auschwitz and liberated the residual inmates. And I say residual inmates because in order to hide their atrocities, the Nazis killed and buried as many of the remaining survivors as they possibly could before the Red Army reached the disgracefully named main entrance, the gate named Arbeit macht frei Gate. In the days before the liberation, Soviet troops, and as the Soviet troops approached, the SS units began the final evacuation of prisoners from the Auschwitz complex, marching them through the snow in the final death march. Very few people survived this death march, including Anne Frank's father, Otto, and Primo Levi. They were among the thousands of others who actually didn't survive it. They were too ill to participate in the death march. 56,000 prisoners of both sexes were led out of Auschwitz and its sub-camp, but most of them died. By the time of the Soviet liberation, over 1 million Jews, well over 1 million Jews had been murdered. And in addition, Sinti, Roma, Poles, and Soviet prisoners of war. And these are figures from Yad Vashem, which is the main memorial center for the Holocaust in Jerusalem. So these were ordinary people who perished. These weren't the only ones, by the way, because there were many other camps. Ordinary people is the theme of Holocaust Memorial Day 2023. So why concentrate on Auschwitz alone? Well, obviously because that was the camp that was liberated, but according to the Simon Wiesenthal Center, the Nazis in fact established many other, 23 main concentration camps, Stammlager they were called, and most of them had satellite camps. So actually, at one point, there were at least 1,000 camps, mainly in Poland, actually, although they didn't exist all at the same time. So why particularly single out Auschwitz? Well, it's true, because the Red Army liberated it, but it's not the only reason. Auschwitz-Birkenau was the largest of the concentration and extermination camps. It was an extermination camp as well. Not all of them were. It was established on Polish soil in 1940 and served concurrently as a labor camp and as a center for absolute rapid extermination. It was the central location really for the annihilation of the Jews, the final solution, and it was equipped with many extermination facilities and crematoria. I think I don't need to go out into the detail of exactly what happened. I think that's well known, but it should be also well remembered. Zyklon B, the substance that had that was used, was previously actually being tested on Russian prisoners of war. So Auschwitz was designated as the final solution for the Jews of Europe. Although the majority of the prisoners held in Auschwitz were killed in the gas chambers, many died from starvation, forced labor, disease, shooting squads, monstrous medical experiments carried out by the so-called camp doctor, Joseph Mengele. The Stockholm Declarations asked us to remember the selfless sacrifice of those who defied the Nazis. So let's remember some of them. Well, one of the most remarkable ones, the true story of Auschwitz, contemporaneously was told by an inmate. Well, two inmates, in fact, Walter Rosenberg, later known as Rudolf Werber, who together with Fred Wetzler, fellow Slovakian Jews, were the first Jews to escape from Auschwitz. Their escape and Werber's eyewitness account is told in Jonathan Friedland's excellent book, The Escape Artist. It wasn't just the escape that was remarkable, it was the fact that Werber and Wetzler committed every detail of the camp and the process of extermination, the final solution, to memory. Why? Because he was determined to warn the Jews of Europe what fate awaited them. A 32-page report, and this is, don't forget, this is contemporaneous. This was 10 days after he escaped from Auschwitz. This was sent to, it was written in Slovakian and translated into many languages, including German, and it was sent to Churchill, Roosevelt, and the Pope, and many of whom ignored it. But the point of doing this for Werber and Wetzler, but particularly for Werber, was to warn the Jews, because Jews did not know they were being transported to their deaths. They absolutely did not know that. They were told that they were going to be resettled after their journey in the cattle trucks. So the remaining Jews, the only remaining Jews in Europe at that time, 1943-44, were the Hungarian Jews. And that's who Werber wanted to warn. He had worked on the ramp and seen exactly that, the preparation, the additional preparation which was made to extend the crematoria and the gas chambers for the Hungarian Jews. And in fact, he didn't succeed entirely, but the Budapest Jews, 200,000 of them, were saved. So Werber's testimony is vital because the Nazis attempted to destroy all the evidence of their heinous crimes. They made bonfires of documents in the camp streets. They blew up crematoria. And although one of them was actually operational when the Red Army arrived. So we've also, in remembering the survivors, we must counter the myth of Jewish passivity in the face of murderous Nazi brutality. Werber's story is one, but there were successful uprisings, particularly at Sobibor, that counters the myth, but there were also two uprisings in Auschwitz itself, quite remarkably so. The first, in October 1943, was a carefully planned one, which involved led by two people, Leon Feldhandler, who was the Polish son of a rabbi, who'd already formed a secret resistance committee. But then he was joined by a Red Army officer, Lieutenant Alexander Pachevsky, Pechersky, who was a seasoned soldier and a Jewish communist. And this gave new impetus to the plan for escape. And there was a rising and there was some escape, which they actually managed to kill the SS camp personnel, quite incredibly so. But it's not, these are things that are hidden from history because this myth of Jewish passivity pertains. But the second rising, 3 months before the liberation, was led by, initiated by 4 Jewish women, Esther Wasblam, Ida Gartner, Regina Salsifan, and others whose name I actually don't know, and I'm not sure who is known. They worked as slave laborers in a munitions factory, and they smuggled gunpowder out. And the gunpowder was then passed to co-conspirators in the Sonderkommando. The uprising was unsuccessful, and they were murdered. So this leads to the question of why it's important to remember. The plain fact is that many people, many people, including governments, would like us to forget, or at least have us believe that anti-Semitism died with the Nazis, and the mantra "never again" only refers to industrial scale genocide. Obviously, there have been other Holocausts following the Shoah, and we call what happened to the Jews the Shoah, but there have been other genocides. And this is also marked on Holocaust Memorial Day. So that explodes the fallacy that somehow never again isn't happening, because it is. Let's look at what's happening today. And I find it quite shocking. Ukraine has a neo-Nazi formation in its armed forces, the Azov Battalion, which people now refer to with equanimity. But this Azov Battalion was initially formed out of the neo-Nazi gang, the Patriots of Ukraine. And the predecessors of that were supporters of Hitler when Hitler invaded Ukraine and massacred Ukrainian Jews. Andrei Beletsky is the gang's leader. He's now the commander of Azov. And he once wrote that Ukraine's mission is to lead the white races of the world in a final crusade against the Semite-led Untermenschen. Beletsky, was a deputy in Ukraine's parliament, and the Azov Battalion still receives arms and training from the US, although they try to hide their Nazi insignia. Other European countries we see now, I mean, it's quite shocking, the rise of fascism in Hungary, Poland, Germany, and Italy. In some cases with sympathetic governments, but in other cases with large fascist parties. And of course, we must face the fact that there is widespread Holocaust denial, or a denial which equates, if it's not denial, which equates fascism with communism, and the European Union is guilty of doing precisely that. So it's sanitized, or at least it's made an equivalent, and it's not regarded as itself from its murderous nature. But closer to home, in Britain, the Community Security Trust, which is there to protect the Jewish community in this country, has recorded in 2021 well over almost 1,500 anti-Semitic incidents across the UK, just in a 6-month period. An incredibly high total, and these are physical incidents. They don't account for social media anti-Semitism. Hope Not Hate actually produced a rigorous, academically very rigorous report called Anti-Semitism in the Digital Age, and it recorded literally 1,356 overtly anti-Semitic tweets per day. Per day. It's still there. So in remembering the Shoah, we must not only correct historical revisionism, but open our eyes to anti-Semitism today and strenuously rebut the notion in the fight against racism that Jews don't count. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. And I'm sure that's very enlightening to some people who may not know the full history around Auschwitz and equating it to today's situation. Can I remind participants that if they have questions, to please put them in the Q&A so that we can take them after the film showing. I'm now going to call upon Jez Benstock, who is the filmmaker, to introduce his film, The Holocaust Tourist. Jez.
Hi. Yes, I decided in the early 2000s, coming up 2005, that I wanted to try and make something about this phenomenon of tourism in Eastern Europe, predominantly in Poland, around the death camps, because I thought it was interesting on a few levels, but probably the most important, or certainly what persisted in the film, is the level on which we affect history by the way that we remember it. And I was concerned that history was becoming oversimplified, and that people needed to think about that strongly when encountering tourism of this kind. What I wasn't prepared for was, as you'll see in the film, both a mixture of this Jewish themed tourism and then also the way in which the tourism was being handled at Auschwitz, which is the camp that's featured in the film. And I just lay it in front of you as the beginnings of a discussion as to how do we remember and how can we hold on to a very complex and difficult history without allowing it to be distorted and bent out of shape for ideological purposes.
Thank you, Jez. Can we have the film then, please? David, can we show the film?
I didn't want to make a film about the Holocaust, but if you're a filmmaker and Jewish, then it comes on the job description. What right have I to make a film about the Holocaust? I'm not a direct descendant of victims or survivors. I'm just a tourist. The idea of visiting death camps has never appealed to me, but when I heard of the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, I knew I wanted to see the 2,000 survivors leaving the camp for possibly the last time. But while everyone else seemed to have transport, survivors were stuck out in the snow for hours.
He's saying that they didn't kill them in the camp, they will kill them here.
In 1946, it was Polish survivors who returned to the camp to stop it being destroyed or forgotten. It was survivors who created the Auschwitz Museum. Without them, there would be no tourism. Seeing how we treat the survivors made me even more uncomfortable about being a tourist. As tourists, we follow a trail blazed by Hollywood. In 1992, Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List put Auschwitz onto the tourist map, but in Krakow, it gave birth to a new kind of tourism.
Steven Spielberg used this main street as the main square of the ghetto. You remember that there's a street full of suitcases. Spielberg used this street. Yes, this building you can see in the movie. The soldiers were going around this balcony. He made artificial gates somewhere here and also at the end of the street.
I spoke to the person who speaks Hebrew, and it's just the mixed letters. It's just an idea to decorate the garden. But everybody asking actually for that, what's the meaning of it? It doesn't have any meaning.
There are guys eating roast pork cutlets in a Jewish-style restaurant. Wonderful they came, and they are doing the little bit they can to identify with Jewish Krakow.
How old do you think those signs are? Do you think they're authentic?
It seems to be authentic, yes.
They're put up 2 years ago for the tourists.
Yes.
Prywatnie nie wierzę w odrodzenie kultury żydowskiej w Polsce.
Just when I thought I understood Kazimierz, I met Emanuel Elbinger. He is a Holocaust survivor who designs Jewish souvenirs.
Dzisiaj już prawie nie ma rzeźbiarzy, którzy pamiętają Żydów z autopsji. Ale oczywiście na początku główne tego robili błędy, bo oni w rzeczywistości Żyda nie widzieli. Widzieli tylko na filmie. Ja myślę, że to jest to stare pokolenie, które już znikło, a chodzi o to, żeby przypominało.
The Galicia Museum also remembers the lost Jewish past.
We've got a series of photographs of what can still be seen today of the physical remains of that culture here in Poland. We need a new set of images to place alongside the pictures of Auschwitz-Birkenau, saying it was a Jewish culture that was destroyed.
If you are a religious Jew aware of the significance of Kazimierz in Jewish history, the very air of Kraków is sacred. The saintly people who lived there, one after the other, the extraordinary influence they had beyond Poland to the present day, wherever Jews live, is immeasurable. I'm not exaggerating. If, however, you're a German tourist, to sip a beer in a Jewish-style cafe in a place which evokes the Jewish past of this city, which was destroyed by your grandparents, may touch you emotionally. If you're an American, it's a beautiful Disneyland.
Tourism to Kazimierz has created a romantic facade which hides a much richer and more difficult past. But nothing I've seen here can prepare me for Auschwitz.
We pick up in Scotland, make our way to Hull, we take the overnight boat, make our way to Magdeburg, where we stay 1 night, 2 nights in Poznan, 2 nights in Warsaw, stopping en route to Chopin's museum, down to Krakow, doing Auschwitz en route, 3 nights in Krakow, 1 night in Berlin, 1 night in Hanover, back to Rotterdam, 13 days in total. Highlights of Poland it's called. It's a good tour.
The biggest traffic starts now. It's about 11 o'clock because most of visitors come here from Krakow.
People who visit the Auschwitz Museum are day trippers. They look as if they've come to Blackpool.
I tell them it's not, we're not going to a tourist site, we're going to a museum, and we're going to a place where many people come to pilgrimage.
There are people who come here to show respect, to try to consider something about our nature, human nature. But another group of people who just came here because they saw a place on a map.
We just thought that we were in the area and we thought we should come and see.
It's important, it's historical.
Kind of just make a vacation out of it, and of course you have to come here.
They are not mentally prepared to be here, emotionally prepared to be here.
A pickpocket warning.
Every such place has, his own amateurs of pickpockets.
Is there an ice cream place here?
Yeah, you can buy ice cream over there in that shop.
Oh, and the hot dog stall, yeah.
Because it's not a place where you can have a picnic after the visiting. I'm very tired, so I'm drinking Coca-Cola.
Do people do that?
Yes. If there are children with their parents, we can do nothing. We do not want to have visitors under the age of 14 because they don't understand.
The slogan above the main gate is very famous. Arbeit macht frei. Work makes you free. So visit starts here. Auschwitz was a kingdom of terror. People were beaten, people were killed, people were chicaned, people were tortured, starvation, overwork, diseases, and so 1942 started mass extermination of Jews in Auschwitz. Block number 5, Jewish belongings. Block number 6, slept here, they were beaten here, they were killed here. It was really a factory of killing.
To be the good guide, you don't need to be the historian, good historian. It's like the mission, I would say.
To go straight to the hearts of those who are here. Maybe not to brains, but to the heart. People had undressed themselves here, and then first women, children, then men, they were let in and they were killed by gas. Look on the visitors, you see first of all they're wondering, they're surprised, they're shocked. Everybody has the same question, why? Why it was possible?
I didn't always feel sad wandering around Auschwitz, but I felt I should be. The Auschwitz experience is overwhelmingly about the suffering of the victims. But what about more difficult questions about human nature, like the fact that the Germans delegated a great deal of the running of the camp to the prisoners themselves?
You need to assume from the outset the tourist is going to understand nothing at all. Or you're going to so totally disorient the tourist that he'll come away saying, gee, I just couldn't make out what all that was about. Given that choice, as a responsible museum, what do? You go for the simple option. And I would say to you, it may be that such a person, even for a few minutes during those few hours, can be touched. Even though I'm aware of all the problems, when people ask me, should we go to Auschwitz? I say, you damn well get off your backside and go there. The dead are waiting for you to come. What I think mass tourism is obscuring is the fundamental fact that Auschwitz is by far and away the world's largest cemetery. There needs to be tombstones carrying every single name of every single person. That would be a very powerful statement as far as the eye can see. 1 million tombstones, try to imagine the extent of that. Now that would put mass tourism into a different frame of mind.
Auschwitz shows us what we can do as a man, as a people.
Do you think all the tourists get that?
Maybe not all. But some of them.
Whether we get it or not, when we visit Auschwitz and Krakow, I've learnt that we are not just passive consumers of history. Because when the last survivor is gone, it's up to us, as Holocaust tourists, to decide which memories are kept alive.
I think people are cashing in on the deaths of a lot of people. It's not the perfect situation, but it's all right if people can be informed about how much these people suffered. If we forget about it now, there's nothing stopping it happening again. It is happening again in other countries, and we're not as far from other countries as a lot of us like to think. You can't spend a day in England without hearing some kind of racist remark. Like it's nothing, just a racist remark. Little groups of people all hating each other because of little differences and things.
A very powerful film designed to make people think about how do we make sure that the memory of Auschwitz and their killing of millions is not distorted, as Jen said. So I'm going to remind you, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. I have one question from Denise Taylor. Do Mary and Jez have any thoughts as to how the history, memories and realities of the Holocaust can be raised and taught in our schools within the curriculum? Mary. You're muted, Mary.
Sorry about that. Yeah. The teaching of history leaves a lot to be desired because, as I kind of alluded to in my talk, what the dominant narrative now is to somehow or other to equate communism and fascism, and therefore the what happened in Stalin's Russia is seen to be an equivalent to what happened in Germany, by the Nazis all over Europe. I don't think there is an equivalent. I know that UK Jewish film are very keen on getting into schools and doing proper Holocaust education, and I know that's happening. I don't think there's any quick and easy answer, because I think as the survivors die, and I know that in the past survivors did go and talk to schools, but there's very few survivors left, and there is always some question raised about memory and whether the survivors have got it right. That's why I think this book, The Escape Artist, is so important, because Werber's account was contemporaneous. Nobody can doubt what he said and what he saw, and he was quite brilliant. So I haven't got any quick fixes for this, other than to say that when the curriculum is actually owned not just by the government and not by private enterprises. It is the Pearsons and all the rest of it. And teachers themselves have got some say in the curriculum, then possibly we can have some proper Holocaust education and some proper education about Nazism, fascism and anti-Semitism, which doesn't make false equivalence and really seeks to understand it for what it is.
Thanks, Mary. Jez?
Yes, it's where it should be taught in the curriculum, because history is only compulsory up to 14, I think it is, and that is obviously a little bit on the young side, just borderline for kids to fully or to begin to get a proper handle on the subject. And in fact, in Poland, they don't. They it's interesting. In Poland, they teach them quite. I visited a school in Oświęcim, the town where Auschwitz is, and found out firsthand and watched the kids getting their 2 stages of Holocaust education. And the first stage, they don't actually teach them; they just take them to the camp, and then in the subsequent year, they then start teaching the contextual history. Now, I kind of feel that the kids are, obviously they're much more switched on in this generation than even, than they were a few generations ago to concerns about identity and discrimination and things like that. It's much more live issues. But yeah, it's very important to try and make things as contemporary for people as possible, and to draw parallels between things like Black Lives Matter, and also to look at contemporary anti-Semitism and how people are becoming very casual about that. So yeah, I don't have any, there's no quick fixes, but I think the younger generation, from the ones that I've met, seem, as I say, potentially much more switched on and much more able to handle as a baseline that holding prejudice is wrong, rather than, when I grew up, holding prejudice was just something that people seemed to do rather than be questioned. So I have hope, but yeah, I think there is a concern about it being pushed out. I feel it should be taught as part of citizenship rather than history.
Thanks, Jez. I have 2 other questions. I'm going to put them to you. Tony Conway says, thanks to our excellent speakers. Do they believe that anti-Semitism is seen as a distinct European issue? And if so, why? Mary?
Well, it's definitely not just a European issue. It's worldwide, unfortunately. And you only need to look at what happened to Jews in Iraq, to Jews in really all over the what we call the Arab world. They were expelled. So it's certainly not just European. Obviously, Holocaust Memorial Day concentrates on the Jews of Europe who were exterminated, but there is a very, very big issue in relation to jihadist anti-Semitism, the kind of the most extreme sort of form of Islamic fundamentalism, which is profoundly anti-Semitic. The protocols of the Elders of Zion are still being circulated in many countries, and there's a conflation, of course, between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And so anti-Semitism is sometimes it morphs into anti-Zionism, and that's certainly the case with those people who are profoundly anti-Israel, but also see that is a Jewish question, and therefore the Jews themselves are the enemy. And that was something that has been taken up by people like Fidel Castro, who called it out and quite in a quite remarkable way. So it's not just a European phenomenon. Unfortunately, it is worldwide. And that's because anti-Semitism is the oldest form of prejudice. It dates back really to to the Christian domination of the world. All the blood libel stuff, all the tropes that are expressed very widely in different ways are ancient, very, very ancient, and they've survived. And it will be beyond the scope of this webinar to really talk about the history of anti-Semitism, but it really has got an incredibly long history from feudal times onwards, and it has not been eradicated.
Thank you, Mary. Jez?
Yeah, I agree with all that Mary is saying, really. Although I think it's not a European issue, but it's a Western issue, in particular in its modern form, which you can probably trace particularly to the rise of eugenics in the Victorian times, and how enthusiastically that was taken up in Britain and in America, very much in America. You know, the eugenic thinking, unfortunately, is still very much circulating around, even having been discredited as pseudoscience. And people enthusiastically take it up from different parts of the world and point to eugenics as a reason for why they're anti-Semitic or racist, saying, look, there's a whole body of evidence and there's a whole body of discussion. And, you know, people like Winston Churchill, he was a eugenicist. You know, there are lots of famous names associated with an apparently scientific reason why we should hate the Jews. Whereas, you know, I quite like the definition of anti-Semitism told to me by a very, very elderly Jewish friend. He said, what's the definition of an anti-Semite? Somebody who hates Jews more than is strictly necessary.
Very interesting description, Jez. I have another question, and can I remind people, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. This is from Mac. Do you think the Western world is erasing Holocaust history through their attempts at profiting out of it? Jez?
Okay, well, yeah, I'm not sure I agree with the profiting out of it. There was a famous book, Norman Finkelstein, Selling the Holocaust, and I found it very overblown and over dramatic, because actually the Holocaust mostly is being weakened because it's being used ideologically. It's being hammered, bent out of shape by, you know, mainstream and far right discourse, the casualness with which people see anti-Semitism now, you know, it's met with a sigh and a pushback. And I'd just like to parallel and just sort of look at what happened when Black Lives Matter blew up and how people pushed back against that and how they sighed, and, you know, anyone who didn't agree with it. There's very similar kind of echoes. People don't like to be told that, you know, we did bad shit. It's you know, the same with, you see it with the slavery arguments now as well. It's like, when I say slavery arguments, obviously no argument about slavery, but people minimalizing it. That's similar things happening with the Holocaust. In Holland at the minute, I don't know if anyone saw this article yesterday. It's on worldwide news that over a quarter of Dutch young people don't believe the Holocaust happened, or believe that it was much, much less bad than is made out. That's what we have to worry about, is that's the wearing down of it. Because actually, I don't think people are making that much money out of it, to be honest, you know, but ideological capital, yeah, quite a lot.
Thanks, Jez. Mary?
I think I agree with Jez, although I wondered if he might comment about his film, really, because in Krakow, clearly, that there is a bit of a Holocaust industry. And I wondered if he wanted to say something about that, because I find it quite disturbing, really. And I know that it was a Polish survivor, a Polish Jewish survivor, who's actually carving those images of Haredi Jews, that, you know, to remind people of what Jews look like. But I must say, I do find it strange, to say the least. One of my grandsons has just returned from Auschwitz. I think he was quite surprised to see that that pork was being served in a restaurant that claimed to be a Jewish restaurant. Obviously, some people are making money out of it. I think equally, actually, some people are making money out of Holocaust denial, but that's another matter. But I'd like just to comment on the film and that aspect of it.
Jez?
Yeah, happily. Yes, I found it a bit distasteful, depending on who was doing it and what they were doing with it. Although it's in Poland, it's complicated because you meet people who are probably Jewish. You're not allowed to, but certainly in 2005 when I was filming there, you're not really allowed to ask people if they're Jewish. It's seen as very rude, which is fascinating because people have hidden their identity if they were Jewish because of what happened after the war, as well as what happened during the war and before the war with the Catholic anti-Semitic. The Catholics were the monsters of anti-Semitism in the run-up to the Second World War. So it does leave a bad taste because a lot of the people involved in the exploitation of Jewish culture, labeled culture, are predominantly people who probably would have colluded during the Second World War. There's no way of saying. And like I said, the Polish partisans were particularly anti-Semitic themselves because they felt that Jews were colluding with the communists, and they fell for that sort of Hitlerian lie that Jews and communists were identical, rather than some Jews were communists and not all communists were Jews. So there's a lot of swirl around it. But yes, I find it distasteful. But I didn't think that people were making massive amounts of money off it. And I kind of agree with the Jonathan Webber comment, was like, if people can be reminded that there was a Jewish culture, even if it's cod and hammy, and even the guy who has the jars in his restaurant garden with Hebrew that means nothing on it, I kind of feel like even that emptiness, it speaks of where we are culturally. But yes, of course, I mean, some people will take it as it's real, it's truthful, and that then becomes a problem. That's what I'm more concerned about, I think, rather than people making a few bob here and there. Nobody's making millions off it.
Thank you, Jez, for your comments. Dina Groden has made a comment, not a question. Anti-Semitism makes no sense. It is illogical and I cannot understand it. I think your struggle, Dina, is the same as a lot of people's. But I have a question from Robert Wilkinson. Most accounts of the Holocaust focus on the extermination camps. The fact that over 1 million were shot or killed by beatings and stabbing before the opening of the camps is largely overlooked. The collaboration of the populations of the Baltic states and Ukraine is largely hidden. How can this distortion be overcome? Mary.
Well, it's a very good point, because the fact is, I can remember taking my children when they were much younger to Yad Vashem, and we looked at the map. I made them look at this map at the entrance, and where it was a huge map of where all the concentration camps were sited, and I asked them to say where the main concentration was, and it was in Poland. So why was it in Poland? Well, largely because anti-Semitism was rife in Poland before the war, well before the war. In Hungary, already there was a fascist dictator, Admiral Horthy, who, that's one of the reasons why the Hungarian Jews were the last to be deported, because Hitler thought that Horthy could take care of them, and it was only because the war was coming to an end that Horthy actually allowed, kind of allowed 200,000 of them as a result of Weber's report to not go to the concentration camps. But the history of anti-Semitism is massive. I mean, many Jews today, my own family included, escaped from Tsarist Russia where they lived in shtetls in the pale of the settlement and were subject to massive anti-Semitic beatings. Latvia, Lithuania, Poland and Tsarist Russia were huge centres of anti-Semitism. And in a way, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to say something about the Azov Battalion, because it was there, it was colluding with Hitler, but it was there as an anti-Semitic force, as were many of them. In fact, after the Russian Revolution, the White Russians tried to use anti-Semitism to undermine the Bolsheviks, and in particular, they were particularly strong in Ukraine. So that the history of anti-Semitism led, and which were deep rooted and deeply ingrained, meant that a lot of non-Jews would collude with the Nazis in trying to root out Jews. It was an everyday thing, in the same way that racism is an everyday, it is an everyday thing. It's been deeply ingrained in popular culture. So I think that Robert's question actually is sort of deeper than that. It wasn't just that these beatings and all the rest of it and killings took place just before the war. They were taking place hundreds of years before the Nazis, before the opening of the camps. And don't forget, it was just 1 million in Auschwitz. I mean, there's over 6 million Jews were killed altogether. And actually, that's not even accurate, because so many of those the stabbing, of the murders, mass murders that took place by, for example, Ukrainians who just killed thousands of Jews and buried them in mass graves before Hitler even got to them. So I think this is a much bigger issue, but we are talking about Holocaust Memorial Day. So in a way, that's the reason for just concentrating on the liberation of Auschwitz, but it is a much bigger issue. And the collusion of many of those populations, and not just of east of the Oder-Neisse line, but also, further west as well, including the French. And, it really needs to be understood to understand that deeply ingrained history of anti-Semitism, which pervaded the world really since feudal times, and particularly Europe.
Okay, thank you very much, Jez.
To answer that question very directly, there's on the BBC iPlayer at the minute is a film called How the Holocaust Began. I mean, it's not actually an origin story of the Holocaust. What it is from the point at which Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, how the killing of Jews escalated and became industrialized. And it covers that exactly the period that you're talking about, exactly the era that you're talking about. So if you want to understand how the Einsatzgruppen, who were the Nazi forces who followed behind the German army as it invaded the Soviet Union to mop up the Jews, that was their instruction. Although there is some debate about whether that was their instruction or whether they just decided that was the best way of carrying out what Hitler wanted, and that they'd been taught by that point for about 6 years or so repeatedly that Jews were vermin rather than just should be hated, which was the general European view. So yeah, that's a very interesting program. I'll paste a link to that in the Q&A if people want to watch it. It's a very good one-off film. And yeah, how do you teach that? Well, how do you make it public? Well, you've got to find people who are willing to talk about it. That's the difficult thing. It's like predominantly, it's really only around this time of year that you get to see stuff which is thoughtful rather than, Channel 5 and History Programme, endless films about Hitler and whatever perversions, or Hitler in colour, Hitler in black and white, perverse Hitler. It's all usually about focusing on that, the very cult of personality, rather than actually what happened on the ground with ordinary people, which I think is terrifying in many ways. And you'll see in that BBC documentary the map of the Baltic states where they have the Imperial War, because it's done by the Imperial War Museum, the film. So it's got a lot of really good factual clout to it. And there's a map of all the places that they've marked in Ukraine, Belarus, Latvia, and Lithuania, where the local people collaborated really heavily with the Einsatzgruppen to eliminate the Jews.
Thank you, Jez. We have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to take, which is a comment plus a minor question from Lorraine Douglas and another question together, if I might. Lorraine Douglas says, I was born in 1959. remember being aware of the Holocaust from an early age, with images and documentaries being regularly shown on TV. I remember being shown the documentary of the Nuremberg trials, which had extensive coverage of the film shown of the liberation of Auschwitz when I was about 14. And this was in school. And those images stayed with me for life. Is it not the case that regularly showing the huge amounts of material on mass media and in schools as part of the history and citizenship curricula is a key tool for keeping the memory alive? And Andy Bain asked the question, has the Israeli government commented on anti-Semitism in Poland and Ukraine today? Mary.
Well, the answer to that question, Andy Bain's question, is if you're talking about the current Israeli government, you are. The answer is no, but for obvious reasons. But it's when I lived in Israel a long time ago. The kibbutz that I was on was a kibbutz that was founded by Auschwitz survivors. They all had concentration camp numbers on their arm. I didn't even realize that until they held a memorial every January, and they all got together. So don't ask me to explain the contradictions. And of course, there is a contradiction, and we're talking about a political situation in Israel at the moment, which none of us can support at all. The most right-wing government ever. I don't expect them to distance themselves from any of this, but that doesn't eradicate the essential point that Israel was a haven for the Jews who escaped extermination initially. And I completely agree with the point that Lorraine made about ensuring that this form of Holocaust education just continues as part of a citizenship program, also part of history. I think that people are studying the history of the 20th century, which they are for O-level, GCSE, sorry, and A-level. But it does worry me that I get the feeling, and I don't want to be negative about this, that there's an element of sort of Holocaust fatigue around. And I just think that as time goes on, obviously with survivors, hardly any of them left, the whole historical memory is okay, captured on film to some extent, but I can't imagine people going to see what many of us did see 20 years ago. The Shoah, made by I've forgotten the name of the director, Jess will remember, the French director, what's his name?
Claude Lanzmann.
Thank you, yes. But I might be wrong about that. I mean, I just don't know. I just think we have to keep plugging away. We have to make that slogan, never again, a real reality. And I think we've got to think of ways of doing it which ensure that the generation coming up, or this generation and the younger ones, really do grasp the significance and the enormity of it. Because if they had, I don't think we would be seeing the rise of far-right parties, almost fascist parties in Europe, which is absolutely prevalent at the moment. You can call it populist nationalism, but when I see the AfD, the Alliance for Deutschland, it is a fascist party. I mean, there's no question about it. So there's a huge amount of work to be done here and everywhere else. And I just hope that the fatigue doesn't set in, and that we really do remember. And we know why it's important to remember, because we need to relate it to what is happening today, and to look at the hateful kind of ways in which those organisations, they're not neo-fascist, they are fascist parties, are attempting to divert workers and people from the real cause of their misery, especially now with cost of living prices and so on. Blame the Jews, to blame the blacks, to blame anybody but their own governments and capitalism.
Thanks, Mary. Jez, is there anything you wish to add?
Just a very small addition. Yeah, totally with Mary on that, all those concerns. And I think to answer Lorraine's point, I think having Holocaust Memorial Day, as Mary says, it's not been around that long, less than, almost 20 years, maybe. But the idea of having a point in the year, I know people complain in the Black community around me, the Black History Month, it should be Black History all year, but actually having a month for Black history, having a Holocaust Memorial Day, these are important cycles, and you will get Holocaust fatigue very quickly by showing the material too much. I mean, I watched something on the Channel 4 website the other day, the All 4, which was about the camps film that was suppressed by the British state, which was a collection of images, some taken by the Soviet army, some taken by the British army, some taken by the German army, of the camps and the liberation. And it truly is the most horrific. Some of the material you'll have seen before, but some of it's so awful. And so, the stuff of absolute nightmares. But it's important to, for us to make sure that, as kids reach the age of about 14, like they do in Poland, that we flag it, to the kids for every generation, that we say, yeah, this is the time we're going to talk about, you're old enough now to begin to think about how awful we can be as human beings. And when we rely, especially on ancient prejudices, just because they've always been around, as if they were true. So, yeah. As for the Israeli government, I'll leave. It's an awful thing. It's an awful thing. And especially at the minute, it's the worst it's been for such a long time. And I can't imagine they'd be that interested in that. They're just isn't interested in international alliances. They're not interested in standing up for, actually the very reason that Israel exists at all, which was it came out about because of the Holocaust. So.
Thank you, Jez. We don't, unfortunately, have any more time for questions. So I'd like to thank both Professor Mary Davies and Jez Benstock for their contributions today. And I'd like also to thank those who put questions. And I think it was very interesting. I just want to make a few remarks as before I close. As we mark Holocaust Memorial Day and we remember the millions who were killed in the Holocaust, we must recognise that nationalism, racism and Holocaust revisionism is on the rise, as Professor Mary Davies pointed out. But as Holocaust survivor Joan Salter very bravely pointed out to the current Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, this month, our government's language on refugees and asylum seekers is absolute poison. Those urging us to turn back the boats inherit their position from those who closed the doors to Jewish refugees as Hitler's armies occupied Europe. And I want you to remember that the words "never again" is never more important, as our speakers have made clear. The fight against fascism is not ancient history. It is with us today, and it is vital we redouble our efforts to fight it. So I urge you to leave this event with an intent to get involved in the fight against anti-Semitism and anti-fascism and take it seriously. Thank you very much for attending, comrades. My final comment is the name of the film that Jez referred to, which is on BBC, is How the Holocaust Began. So if you want to look it up. Thank you very much for attending, everybody, and I hope you found this interesting.